So they'll be calling you a radical. We're with Rachel. This is important video. You're going to get this nowhere. This is historical stuff. She has all the data from Fukushima, from the disaster. She was there, and she was the activist. All kinds of boots on the ground work. Let's get right to it, Rachel. Go. So
Okay.
Let's start with this. This is alarming stuff.
Yeah, so this is, of course, this is the reactor here, and this is the surrounding areas. This document I printed off of the website from the Ministry of Health and Education in Japan, and it's got several maps here you can see. This one's from July 2nd, 2011. The reason I got this was because my daughter was in the 6th grade and they were planning their 6th grade camp in 2011. And I was not going to allow her to go because they were sending her to just about this area right here. So I took this to the parent-teacher meeting when they had the meeting about, the trip and all the things that you need to prepare for the trip. And it was one other mom and myself who didn't want our kids to go there because they were going to be camping and going through the mud, hiking through the mud, visiting a dairy farm and drinking the milk and making butter, and I didn't think it was safe because this is from the Ministry of Health and Education, their own department, for health and education ministry, and their data says that in this area, this dark blue right here is 60,000 to 100,000 becquerels of cesium-134 and 137 per square meter.
And that's where she was going.
That's where they sent them.
Whoa.
Well, that's where they all went.
Now
My daughter was the only.
Let's make sure we get these dates correct.
Okay.
This is in 2011.
2011.
The summer of.
Yeah.
Now remember, I want people to remember, this didn't just blow up in March of 2011. I have the footage and the video of it re-blowing up again in June. And so this data is even worse then. And again, Rachel's data proves and shows she went and did data, sent to independent labs, blah, blah. So we have backup documentation. This is solid, concrete science. Go ahead.
Okay, so obviously the radiation doesn't just stop there. I lived a little bit further out this way, but you can see that it's densely polluted with cesium-137 and 134, and that's why we didn't let our kids go. One of the moms actually went there, took a train ride one day, and took her Geiger counter and checked around, and she decided that she was going to let her kid go because she found that it wasn't too bad on her Geiger counter. But I can't argue with the government data. If I were to argue with it, I would argue that it was worse than what this is.
Yeah, but let's back up on this because the Geiger counter data, you can go out across anything with Geiger. It's worthless. I'm here to tell you it is worthless science because it's not enough inset, there's not a background, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you can get a Bosch-Podge number anyway. In science, they don't get it. So let's talk about what you did do in 2012. Rachel did, and we'll tag the video. Rachel actually went 150 miles away from Japan where she lived and gathered in gutters, in schools, in dumps, multiple materials, dirt, and sent it to independent lab. And had the independent, so we know that this Geiger counter reading here is totally worthless because your data shows that
Further away.
a year later it was horrifically contaminated. So let's.
Yeah, well, 1 year later, you can see here, they were testing the pollen. Now, if you can imagine how when the reactor exploded, the dust just fell blanketed everywhere, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but just think of a forest. How are you going to clean up a forest? You got to do it real quick. If you're going to try, you got to do it real quick. If not, this is what ends up happening. It gets it down into the soil, then the trees pull it out, and then they tested the pollen a year later, and the pollen was radioactive. Imagine all those people in Tokyo, and that's not going to stop. That just recirculates in the environment.
It's ongoing.
So, we were talking earlier about the Olympics. These are things you got to consider. If you're an athlete, you want to be breathing in radioactive pollen. And I feel really bad to say this because I love Japan. I have a lot of friends and family there, and they have no choice, nowhere to go, and it's part of their reality that they just have to accept it. But But this is also reality, you know, this is that we have to look at it, we have to realize it, and then make our decisions based on truth.
So quickly, I want to say this so people understand this. Rachel's a San Diego girl. She's born and raised down here in SoCal, in, you know, Chula Vista. And so she was in Japan. She was married to a Japanese man in Japan. She has 3 young children that were born over there. I mean, she's a young mother. This is important. So could you say some in Japanese, the Japanese viewers that are watching this, as the mother, speak just a little bit about what your concerns were in Japanese briefly, if you possibly could.
こんにちは皆さん。日本に住んでた時はすごく心配しました。子供たちの体、放射のことをいっぱい心配しました。で、今その話をします。その時6年生のキャンプみんなでこの辺に行ったでしょ。これはもういっぱい放射能が出てた。これは7月、平成23年の7月の時、これはMETI、メティのデータで、1年後はこれは花粉が出てる。だから放射能が来るとまた回る、空気に出る、花粉に空気に出るで、どこでもで、私の家の前にもいっぱい放射能があったから私は日本から出たけど、今いっぱい人たちまだいるから、とても心配です。
So,
放射能のこと。
so again, and this is just so background on her. I want this background's important. She is a genius, by the way. So this is not crackpot. There's so much out there in the so-called scientific community. They'll come back at us. Oh, you're novices. You're not scientists. No, we are the scientists. And I want to talk about this community of ours and the group. These are the best of the best. So how about we talk a little bit about, you're in Japan, okay? This nightmare is unfolding. You have to flee Japan. Japanese husband, comfortable Japanese lifestyle. You know, the whole thing, and they're lying. You know they're lying. They proved that you're lying this for a couple of years. Well, the other videos will tag. You can watch and catch up. So you had to fly. But tell a little bit about your having to flee back to Chula Vista in Spanish.
In Spanish, okay.
If you could.
En español.
Because this is important for that
Okay,
community
yeah.
down there. I mean, this is
Okay.
affecting Mexico just as hard as it is here. And I
Yeah.
think people in Mexico need to get this and
Yeah.
understand this.
Cuando yo viví en Japón, tenía que salir porque tenía el radiación, tenía mucha radiación allá y tenía mis niñas. Y en ese tiempo no tenía dinero para salir, pero salimos y nomás vivimos con personas de lugares diferentes, con personas de mi familia. Fuimos a Texas, vivimos aquí en Chula Vista y vivimos en el carro también. No tenía mi casa porque mi esposo no vine conmigo. Y yo pensé que aquí también tiene radiación. Y sí, es cierto que vine desde Japón hasta acá, pero es mejor que allá. Yeah.
So I want people to know we're shooting this video in Pacific Beach in San Diego, right on the ocean. Now we met last night at the local. We had Yoko there, and Rachel and I have Skyped with some of the great actors. She says she's the female in Japan. I haven't put those videos up because I know what happens to those people in Japan.
Mm.
So this is all verifiable stuff. So we have Peter here with us. Now Peter's a local, born and raised San Diego boy. His father's the famous bookseller. He grew up in a very literature-educated thing. And I want to talk about how our activism, groups of activists, and people get frustrated and how important this work is. Because briefly Rachel, talk about you watching and my videos inside Japan.
Yeah, that was a great help to me because at the time it was really confusing because there's all these different stories. I had actually evacuated to Okinawa with my kids a few days after the first explosion, and then my husband didn't go with me, so it was just me and the girls. Took a ferry to Okinawa, and that's when I started reaching out to the international community. I didn't have TV back in Yokosuka. I had my own TV. I could watch Japanese news. And I was always confused, is this a nuclear explosion? What just happened? And they were saying, no, it's a hydrogen explosion. It's a hydrogen explosion. There was no, leaking, no radiation leaked, and it's totally fine. For about 6 weeks, they lied about that until the government finally came out and apologized for lying. And then they kept on lying. But the only truth I could find was from the international community via the internet, and YouTube was really great because I not only could get information, but I could share. The way I was feeling was frustrated and angry and confused, and I was being treated like I was crazy. And so it was really awesome to be able to watch other people like Kevin, who was also angry and frustrated, and he was less confused. And so I got a lot of my information from him about what was going on. Was this actually a nuclear explosion? And he was like, well, I didn't talk to him, but in his videos, he was confirming, like, this is a freaking nuclear explosion.
Meltdown.
Yeah.
It's called meltdowns. So, anyway, so Rachel goes through this whole dynamic for 2 years, gathering data. She becomes the incredible activist over there with other activists who we've talked to who are still in Japan. It's very dangerous. Do not kid yourself. It's dangerous here. It's getting a little more dangerous because they boiled the frogs nicely. So Rachel comes back to San Diego. Of course, I get leukemia. I'm fighting for my life, struggling. I'm back in San Diego all the time, fed and sun off free, whatever. So she's back here. I don't know this, but she's afraid. She has 3 young children, obviously. I get it. So she's avoiding all this because she's afraid. She's got her young children. They're back here. And so I want you guys, you and Peter, to talk about this story of how we connected and put this data out last year. So tell us this story, Peter.
Basically, I worked for Greenpeace for about 3 days. I'm sorry. But
my condolences.
I'm not a salesman. But anyway, because I was kind of hooked up with them, they invited me to come to this Hands Across the Beach, or Hands Across the Sand thing down in Mission Beach, just 5 miles south of here on the beach. And just happened to run into Rachel because we were standing on the end of the line on the far south.
You're holding hands, right?
And we were all holding hands. This was the deal. And then we started talking, and she had said she had lived in Japan, because I said I'm an anti-nuker, and she said she had been living in Japan, and I said, hey, Kevin Blanche, and she's like, oh my God. And so then we kept on talking about it and stuff, and right there on the beach, I called Kevin up and put her on the phone with him, and I suppose the rest is history.
I was like, this is crazy. I'm talking to Kevin.
So he's like, well, I know Kevin. I got his phone number.
Yeah.
I'll call him right now. And so I picked up the phone right there, and he says, hey, there's this girl here. Rachel, what, she's from San Diego? She was in Japan? Yeah, watch her videos. She's got data. She got laughed at it. Peter knows what he's talking about, and I trust everything he says. He's one of the true great of our post-ignorance army that's been there from the beginning. I know if he gets me something, I know it's no BS. And we have our small army out there, very real. There's about 300 around the world. And I know if they say something, you can take it to the bank, cast it in gold, gild it in concrete, and chemo in your bone marrow. And so he says, look, and so he put her on the phone. I said, you have this data? Yeah, I have all this, and I'm like, I'm getting on a plane now. And so I jumped on a plane the next day or two, and Rachel picks me up at the airport, and I'm like, Tourmaline's my place, Canyon here. I says, let's go, right? The sun's setting on me. She wasn't ready for that interview. I wasn't ready. I said, let's just do it. And so she was so good at it, she threw that data out there. And I'm telling you, that data has changed the world, because I had 2 MIT scientists show up to my room in Monterey recently who are in Rosemary's program at MIT, and they said, their PhDs for the head of the snake, or they says that interview is a buzz in there, her data. Her work is so scientific and incredible, so as the grassroots scientist, we're not just activists, the real research PhDs is powerful, and that's my point. Peter has stayed in this fight, behind the scenes, whatever, blah, 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 but you don't think it matters. The little thing matters, it matters. How far along are we on this interview, Lisa? What time are we at?
15 minutes.
Oh, we got plenty of time. So I'm going into some of your
Yeah.
real concrete stuff from here.
So linking to watching your videos, that's what kind of inspired me to try to find out, search for the truth, more and more, because I was getting these conflicting stories. It's not, dangerous, it's dangerous. And so I just started asking YouTubers, how do I live with radiation? How do I stay here and raise my family with this thing
Now,
going
you
on?
knew nothing about the nuclear industry.
Nothing. I didn't even know where my light energy came from. I didn't.
Hey, you spoke on that, but you were a mother.
Yeah.
So this was all mother, good San Diego Chula Vista instincts, which
And
perfect.
so then I started, going online researching stuff, and I came across, the Chernobyl pictures. Let me just grab that just to show a couple of them. And this freaked me out, pictures from kids that were born to kids that had low dose radiation exposure over long periods of time, and these pictures scared the heck out of me. I cried. I thought to myself, one, I got to tell everybody. Two, we're not prepared to take care of these kids. Like, I and my friends who are mothers, are we prepared to have grandchildren with these issues? No. And I even question myself as a human being. Am I even capable of loving enough to take care, or will my children be capable of taking care? And it was just all these crazy things in one day. It was like one moment that it was just, it hit me. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I just fell apart. And that's when I even looked at what was the distance between where Belarus was to where the reactor was in Chernobyl, and we lived exactly the same distance from Fukushima. And I said, this is us right here. And so I made this little booklet and started trying to tell people about
Talk
it.
a little bit about, as you became the mother citizen scientist, beautifully, incredibly, historically, it just shows you how powerful her mind is. And she's, I'm telling you, what a gem. So, talk about, as you and the other activists, which we've Skyped with them, and I'm telling you, you think I'm intense, and they know over there, but like I said, talk about what kind of government pushback you got in the school system as you were trying to expose the truth and their lies. Talk about that culture and how this cover-up ran.
Yeah, they wanted. Well, I had borrowed a Geiger counter from a fellow teacher in Yokohama who's from Northern Europe somewhere, and his mom right away sent him this really nice Geiger counter, and so I borrowed that from him and started taking testings and stuff. And so the other moms would be with me, and they would freak out and like, put that away, don't they didn't want anybody to see, and I was like, why? It's totally fine. And so I would just end up going by myself. Then I started connecting with other moms that were also concerned. They started telling me things like, they're not checking the milk, they're mixing good milk with radioactive milk, so it becomes below the limit. And then we discovered that the school lunches were not being checked, and then we discovered where the food's coming from. And so then we started going to the city office like daily to talk with the city officials, trying to figure out, how did you guys come up with the city limit? How did you come up, because every city had a different city allowable limit.
Well, this data that you have on the beef, this is a good spot for that. Tell that brief story on the beef at Fukushima, Japan.
Yeah, well, so in Yokohama, I have I printed it all. It's these just concerned parents.
Let's show these.
Because every cow, since the United States had an issue with what was it, mad cow disease or something like that.
Mad cow.
Yeah, Japan has a number for every single cow, and so you can actually trace back where the cow comes from. And so these parents had been tracing these cows that were just after Fukushima had happened. The cattle ranchers started selling their cattle because they were being evacuated. And so these cows were contaminated, heavily contaminated. And it's hard to find because they said that there are different spots of the body. So you could check a cow with a Geiger counter and that doesn't really do anything. But when you cut them up, you can check one piece of meat from the leg and one piece of meat from the shoulder, and it's going to be totally different readings when you put it in an incinerator. And plus, they're not going to be chopping up all the beef and putting it in an incinerator to check, because then they can't serve it, they can't sell it. So they were selling these cows that had been contaminated and sold to other places in Japan. And then Yokohama bought a bunch of this beef and served this beef that was highly contaminated to the children. So thousands of
In
children.
the schools, right?
In schools.
Elementaries.
Elementary, junior high. So these were parents that were very upset about this. And this was also proof to me that what I thought was happening was actually happening.
Cover up.
That they were going ahead and selling things that were questionable without checking, without testing, obviously. And every week I would get the menu of what was being served in the school lunches, and it tells you where it's from. I've got it here. I've got, this week we're going to be serving pork, and the pork is from this area or that area. And they weren't checking it, but you could tell, like, if it's in that map zone, if it's from this area, you don't want to eat it, right? But then they had all these campaigns,
Well,
support the farmers.
Here's the thing. So we need to talk about this quickly. So people know this is an ongoing catastrophe that never stopped. Okay, the cover up, this stuff was not questionable. We know that. It was just downright fraud and a lie in the whole machine, because it's coming up now, orchestrated by the United States, by the way, pulling the strings. So where we should talk real quickly to caveat this is the evacuation when you were there. And we'll tie this in the U.S. Reagan. We'll do another one. We're going to get multiple of these.
Yeah.
And so this ties into the cover up, this food feeding to the children. But when this first happened, because we're hoping the Edwards clan meets up with us later today, and so the lawyers on the USS Reagan and this whole dynamic. So talk a little bit about the confusion in the early days of the evacuation and how that played out where you were at. And tell them where you were at and how that played out.
So I was 150 miles away from the reactors, and I was right next to the military base. In fact, my mom and dad had moved out to Japan to live near the grandchildren, and my dad was working at the commissary on the base, which is the supermarket on the Navy base, Yokosuka Navy base. And so I got a lot of information from there, and then a lot of my church members were also base people in the military. In fact, I've got a friend who's a very close friend of mine whose husband worked on the carrier there, the George Washington, and they had all of their alarms went off because they're a nuclear ship, and so when they have that happen, they had to pull out to decontaminate because they
Now this is important. This is new data. This is real important. You told me this story last night. I'd never heard this story before. Now the George Washington is right there. The radiations, because they have reactors on those ships. She told me they went off. Now say that again, so this is real important. So the siren, you're telling me the sirens went all off on the reactors. Mm-hmm. So, and they knew that there was hot radiation all over. Now how far away was the George Washington from the reactor?
150 miles.
So
I was
this is
actually, when the
important.
earthquake happened, I was standing in
So
front
this is
of the
important.
George Washington, and the what is it, the bow where people walk
How
from
many
the-
minutes are we on this video?
24.
Okay, at
Okay.
29, we're going to have to shut it off. 29:50. So listen, this is real important, Rachel. Real important. This is new. Because
Okay.
people are talking about this. So the George Washington's 150 miles away from these reactors.
Yes.
Now you're telling me that alarms went off when? Right when it happened that day?
Yeah, when the explosion
So
happened.
listen. So this is so important. So as it plumed up, they're saying this is just a hydrogen blast. For the USS Reagan's alarms, so I know how these alarm systems work on these ships because I'm involved in this thing. This has to be, this ain't no little number that sets those alarms up, because if that happened, it would happen constantly on these ships. Mm-hmm. These ships get low readings, medium readings constantly because they have reactors on them. Their background, they're in a different place. For alarm to go off on the George Washington, these numbers had to be gargantuous. So this is new. She told me this last night. So the alarms go off that day 150 miles away. Okay, now go ahead.
Let me just take one step back and say
Okay.
that this is from like our local city office. So the Japanese are very, very, or not all, but a lot of them are very anti-nuke before Fukushima. And they kept a very, very, very close eye on anything nuclear. And they, whenever there's a nuclear sub or whenever the carrier comes in, they protest. Okay, so this, I mean, you can see right there's the picture of the carrier right there.
That's the Washington.
Okay, so that's why, and then, you know, what you need to do if something nuclear happens because of the Americans, you know. So they have to pull out because they had to prove that it's not coming from them. So that's protocol. So if that happens, they have to pull out and decontaminate, clear everything off, and make sure that they're not the ones that are leaking the radiation. So that happened right after
And that's Japanese activists that created that protocol.
Yes, yes.
I have a question. Did they scram the whole base? Basically, I mean, did they tell
No,
everybody to leave?
no. Well, at
Oh,
first, at first, yes.
Wow.
So that's what goes into the next thing. Was then they called for an evacuation, and the next day they on base. Well, they were going to actually, when the carrier was going to come back, they were going to take families out on the carrier and evacuate.
See, this is why so many people were watching my videos in the days. Gunderson's in there telling me this is hydrogen, but I'm like, bullshit. I know because it's a Mach 1, Mach 2. And I've been so hell in San Onofre. They'll tell you, the NRC will tell you, the regulatory, the Nuclear Energy Crime Syndicate will tell you, we can handle up to about a 7.8, then the cords will crack. I was in the Energy Solutions dump site protesting when this happened. I got home and I saw, that's live cams by Chinese activists, Japanese activists, and I know what that live cam is. I saw it and I heard it was a 9. I'm like, these cores are completely fractured, it's on, it's not even the tsunami, it's on. So I knew, so I had been getting lots of people inside Japan were coming to me, including Kathy Iwan, who was married like you, who's paramount in this fight, Peter knows her, yourself, different people all over, but I had people giving me stuff from the inside, on the Reagan, on blah, 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 blah. So I'm reporting, and what I was going on the ground because third party, I'm like, they have ordered a full-blown out evacuation. Now we know inside the Situation Room, the Admiral had ordered not only a full evacuation of every single United States military personnel in Japan, all civilian, and he stuck to it for many months. So tell us how that played out over there.
Well, they changed it to a voluntary evacuation.
How long was
well,
this?
No, it was just a day after, like 1 or 2 days.
To voluntary.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many
And then-
voluntary evacuated?
A lot.
Everybody?
Yeah, the base was empty.
There
The
you
base
have
was
it.
empty. Navy Federal Credit Union was totally closed. You couldn't go to the bank. The commissary was the only thing open because my dad still worked there, and the gas station. But it was like a ghost town. It was really weird. We went from like in my church, it was like 40, 50
They
people.
said at 29:30, shut it off and cut us off, and then we'll do another
Yeah,
one.
but you know what? I want to.
You're at 28:30 now.
Okay, well, I wanna
let's
just
One
get
more
to
minute.
get to a
So
good spot.
We'll just
Yokosuka's down.
continue this.
Yokosuka's down here, and the Reagan was out here. Okay, and I got all my data from down here. Now this is showing the wind blowing this way. When they don't have data for out here, but the Reagan was out here. When it happened, when it exploded, the wind was blowing
6
that
days
way.
straight,
and
yeah.
that's what saved us.
Prevailing.
That's
Right.
what saved us. But that's
Anderson
not what,
Cooper, Sanjay Gupta were there on the boots on the ground. Remember live? And they're like, should we get out? This thing's going, I'm screaming, get the fuck out. But they put the Reagan in right up next to it. Now we know
Yeah.
Holdren, and I'll talk about that because I know what happened in the situation. Make it so, and they lied. This is for
They knew.
Edwards.
They knew.
And I
If we
can
knew
prove
over
it now.
here, if we knew over
Well, we
here,
have the proof now,
yeah.
Rachel, because John Holden got tricked by our friend and did the interview at 3:43 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and said, so we knew they were a full blown out meltdown. So this
Yeah, they
suit
knew.
against TEPCO's bullshit.
Like Gene Stanley.
Who's the guilty party? The United States government. Obama knew, Holdren knew, they all knew. Yet they radiated these people anyway.
Wrap it
including-
up.
Okay.
Wrap it up.
So let's cut this off, upload it, and continue this. This is important
Go
stuff.
Rams.
This is going right to them. Okay.